It's time that we implement some roles for the users on this site. This will help us in implementing authorization so that we can define who is allowed to do certain actions. This site will only have three main roles: admin, musician, and employer. As you can see, the roles are defined as properties of this simple role class. This way, we can add more roles if our application starts to grow and needs different functionality. Each user needs to have a role. That means that we need to add another column to the user table. I will call it role ID. Don't forget to initialize this role ID inside of the init method. The default role can be the role admin. I'll also define two helper methods for working with roles. The first one will check if the user is admin by comparing the role ID to the admin property. The second method will check if the user has a role from the parameter. It simply compares that role to the role ID column. The role class has nothing to do with SQL Alchemy, but we need to create a migration because we added the role ID column to the user model. I will create a new migration for this and update the database. Now we can incorporate these roles in the registration view. The role taken from the form will be passed to the user's constructor. To make this possible, we need to define a role field inside of the registration form. This will be a radio field with only two choices: musician and employer. Now let's render this field in the template. Instead of just rendering the field instance, I will loop through all of the passable options. If I now go to the registration page, you can see that we have these radio buttons representing the possible roles. Some views that we'll create later will only be available to the users with a certain role, so let's create the role required decorator inside of the authentication blueprint. The decorator is similar to the login required, except this one will redirect the user if it doesn't have a certain role. Notice that this decorator takes in the role parameter. So we have a wrapper function, a decorator, and another method which will let the decorator take in the role argument. You can name these methods any way you want. I just prepend one more underscore at each level to avoid any confusion. We will also need the access to the role class from the templates, so let's inject it in the same way we did for the current user. Of course, don't forget to import the role class from the models. Now that the class is available in templates, let's use it to modify them. In the show account template, I will set the profile image variable based on the role of the shown user account. So if the user is not admin, we can render a profile placeholder image from the static directory. If you downloaded the source code, these images will already be present. This site will only have placeholders. If you want to implement some uploading functionality, check out the course on Flask WT forums. I will also print out the user's role under the username to make the distinction between different kinds of users on the site. We can also add another button for sending emails if the user account belongs to a musician and the currently logged in user is an employer. This is the only way that employers can communicate to musicians on the site. One last thing to add are the gigs connected to this account. If the user is not admin, we can add a secondary car div. If the account belongs to a musician, then these gigs that we will render will be the gigs that this musician has applied to. If this is the employer account, then the gigs will be the gigs that he posted on the site. Of course, we cannot show any gigs because we didn't create them yet. We'll do that in the next lesson, but let's see what we created first. I'll register as an employer by picking the employer role on the registration page. After that, I can log in and check out my account's show page. You can see that I have this employer placeholder image and the text that represents my role on the site. If I go to the show page of some musician account, you can see that this information is changed accordingly, and I can also send him an email.